I think there are far more climbers capable of climbing hard routes than there are climbers who have actually done them. I don't think that gap is mainly physical, but I do think the gap is made up mostly of fear of failure, ego, and how people approach the process of trying something hard. Because when you really look at it, most climbers don't actually find their true limit. They stop when the process starts asking more of them than they're willing to give. I'm Matt Wright, and this is episode 6 of A Climber's Mind. I think a lot of people look at routes in a very black and white way. Can I do it or can I not? Am I strong enough or not? Is this my grade or not? But that's not really how hard climbing works. A better question is this: what would this route require of me? And am I willing to go through the process of becoming the person who can climb it? I believe most people could climb pretty much any route they have their mind on if they were willing to stay with them long enough, to learn the intricacies of them, to adapt to them, and to understand them deeply. Now, I'm not saying that anybody can just rock up to any route and do them, but what I am saying is that if you give your body time to adapt and take that time to learn a route in a very intricate way, it's amazing what that time can do. Honestly, I think one of the biggest things that stops people from finding their true limit is fear of failure. Not in an obvious way, but in a quieter way. They don't want to commit to something that might actually really challenge them and force them into a place of vulnerability. They don't want to spend 20 sessions on a route and still be there. They don't want to try something that might show them that they're not as capable as they'd hoped. So instead, they stay just below the line, strong enough to believe, but not exposed enough to really find out. And the interesting thing is this: fear of failure in climbing rarely sounds dramatic. It usually sounds pretty sensible. I'll try that when I'm stronger. It's probably too hard for me. It's not a good use of my time. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's just protection. Now, from my perspective, fear of failure has always been there in my own climbing. Pretty much every route I've ever projected, I've had my doubts sitting just under the surface. I've been incredibly frustrated at times. I've questioned not just whether I can do it, but whether I'm even worthy of trying it. And on most of the hardest things I've done, I've actually walked away at some point and then came back later. And what's really interesting is that when I return, I don't usually feel noticeably stronger. I'm just more willing and more determined, because the thing I fear most is walking away from something I care deeply about, knowing I gave up on it. So I come back more accepting of how hard the route actually is, with less ego, and I'm better prepared to give it the time it needs. And that shift alone makes a huge difference. When it comes to training, there's only 2 projects I've ever properly stepped away from and trained for. Those routes are Rainshadow, a 9A at Malham Cove that I've spoke about a few times before, and Free at Last, a 9A plus at Dumbarton Rock that I've been trying for about 2 years. I've had around 50 sessions on Free at Last, maybe more, I've lost count. But around August last year, I got to a point where I felt really good on it. I felt like if everything lined up perfectly, I might have a chance of doing it. But the chances were still very low, and around that time, I had to step back due to some difficult life circumstances. I lost momentum on the route, and I had a choice there. I could let that stop me completely, or I could use it. So instead of throwing the towel in, I stepped back properly and focused on physical training. I made a plan to build back up on the route over time. It was fairly easy for me to make this decision because throughout August last year, it was becoming pretty clear to me that I needed to be physically stronger to improve my chances on those top moves. There's a difficult balance with projecting because you need familiarity on the route, and in many cases, the best way to get strong for a route is by trying those exact moves. But there's a tipping point. For me, if I stop making progress after around 10 sessions in a relatively short window, it's usually a sign that something needs to change. And that might be my physical capacity, lifestyle, psychology, or my tactics. And sometimes the most productive thing you can do is step back, improve the foundations, and then return with a better chance of success. But the important thing is this: I didn't come to that conclusion after a few sessions. I came to it after 50. Free at last is defined by an 8B plus or 8C boulder problem about 15 metres up the main wall of Dumbarton Rock. For me, it's around 25 sustained hard moves, and the main difficulty sits right in the middle of that, which for me feels like an 8B boulder in its own right. So over time, I had to build the route in pieces. I've gone from the ground partway through the 8B boulder crux. I've also gone from 4 moves in to the last hard move, and then from the start of the 8B boulder crux all the way to the top. Now, that might sound a little bit confusing without the context, but the point is those links didn't just happen. They had to be built very carefully and very systematically, one piece at a time. And through doing that, I was able to understand exactly what was stopping me. And this is where it gets interesting, because you could argue that more strength work would always help. And in some ways, that's true. But if all I did was step back and train strength in the abstract, I'd never build the skills required to actually execute something like this. The way I view it is you can train strength on the route, but you can't train the specific skills required to execute a route like this using a fingerboard. So without my time on the route, I'd never learn the route deeply enough, and I'd probably never find my true limit. So it creates a bit of a paradox. You need strength, but you also need exposure. You need to step back, but you also need to stay in it for long enough to understand it properly. And finding that balance is a really big part of projecting well. You don't really understand your limitations until you've been exposed to them properly. And most climbers never do that because they don't stay long enough. That's why I think projecting's a skill, because it's not just about trying hard routes, it's about closing the gap between what you're capable of and what you actually realise. Another important distinction is this: the difference between commitment and attachment. Commitment is staying with the process, whereas attachment is needing the outcome to protect your self-worth. They feel very similar, but one helps you and the other one ruins the process. I think we all have both, and I know that when I'm attached, everything becomes harder. One of the reasons projecting is so powerful is because it exposes everything: your technique, your tactics, your preparation, and your mindset, because you're repeating the exact same thing over and over again, and that removes the noise. But there's also a flip side to this. Sometimes people do too much projecting. They stay on one climb for too long, and their climbing starts to narrow. Less movement variety, less learning, and eventually they plateau. So for me, it's not just about persistence, it's about knowing when persistence is still productive. A simple rule I use is to reassess every 10 sessions. Am I still progressing? Is this still serving a purpose? Is this still meaningful? Because projecting doesn't always feel good. It's not always fun. There's frustration and doubt and sometimes boredom. So there's not much value in questioning whether you're enjoying it, but it is good to question whether the route is still helping you grow, and therefore providing the self-fulfillment that you may be looking for. Now let's talk about some practical steps to help you project. Something I see all the time is people just trying as hard as they can from the start, over and over again, with no plan, no structure, and no tracking. They just redline and fall off. They'll rest for barely 2 minutes on the rope and then do exactly the same thing again. In a lot of cases, they get so fatigued that they can barely even make it to the top of the route on dog, and they burn themselves out in less than 10 sessions. But a true project that set your limit isn't about trying it from the ground. It's about building links, bigger and bigger links, more carefully and more deliberately over time. There's a form of climbing called dogging, which is where you're moving between the draws, working sections and resting on the rope. And your first few runs on a route should be just to dog up the route, go from draw to draw, figure out the moves, and avoid doing big links. If you're getting really fatigued, you're probably doing too big a links at the start. You need to avoid doing aimless links until you've actually got the moves figured out. Whereas the ill thought out approach of just redlining every time you pull on creates a reactive response to the moves. This means that you don't get the moves figured out properly, the quality goes down, and then you actually take much longer to do the route. For me, one of the most effective ways to work a route is a top-down approach. I usually start with the climbing after the crux and figure out the top of the climb first. I don't just scrape through it once. My aim is to build a reliable sequence, something repeatable, consistent and highly detailed. I make that section so familiar that I'll stop reacting to it. I need to know every move and work out the best beater before I move on. Then the next stage is to begin adding moves from the crux into that top link, but only one move at a time. And I'll keep doing that until I'm at the start of the crux. For almost any sport, trad or long boulder project, one of the key links is going from the start of the crux to the top. And when it comes to linking moves into the crux, it just depends on the route. It depends on how tiring that entry climbing is, and how much fatigue changes the difficulty of the crux itself. Something I like to do is cut my optimism in half. So for example, if there's a 7C intro into the crux, I might be tempted to tell myself it's not hard enough to bother linking. I might just think I may as well just go from the start. But one thing I've realised over time is that cruxes often feel significantly harder once even fairly moderate climbing is added in. So even if I think there's a chance that I could do it from the start, I'll often still add half of that lower climbing into the crux and to the top, before I start putting the pressure on with full attempts. So instead of jumping straight into a red point, I'll build towards it. I delay the pressure for as long as possible. And what that does is it gives me a chance to practice performing without the full weight of the red point being there. And the key to all this is small marginal progress. One move at a time. Sometimes not even a full move, sometimes just a foot move is enough. That's how you build consistency. I like to think project execution sits inside a really simple framework. Pre-climb, during climb and post-climb. Pre-climb is about preparation. You organise, you research, you visualise. You anticipate what's coming. You warm up properly, and you prepare yourself to focus. During the climb, you execute. Focus on breathing, awareness, pacing, and attention to detail. Post-climb is where you learn. You reflect, you adjust, and you visualise again. And that creates a feedback loop where each attempt feeds into the next, and that's what drives progression. If this episode resonates with you, and you know you'd benefit from a more structured and integrated approach, that's exactly what I help climbers do through my coaching. We look at your climbing as a whole: physical, technical, tactical, mental, and lifestyle, so we can identify the real limiter and move performance forward in the right way. So if there's one thing I'd like to leave with you, it's this: stop asking, can I do it? And start asking, am I willing to stay here long enough to find out why I can't? Because that's how you find your true limit. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.